Welcome to Crawlspace. I'm Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
I'm doing fantastic today, Tim, for a number of reasons that we'll get to. I hope everyone out there is doing fantastic as well. And one of those reasons I'm not doing fantastic is because I don't know how you're doing, Tim. How are you?
Well, I'm doing great. Thanks a lot for asking. Yeah, very excited to have our old friends back on the show. That's Doctors Shiloh and Scott of the wonderful podcast, LA Not So Confidential. They are forensic psychologists, and man, they do a great show.
And they also come on this show, and they really make us feel like we are a little bit smarter at the end of the conversation, and we didn't even realize that they were teaching us because they do it in such a natural way.
They are very casual with dropping their knowledge, Lance. And in this episode, we are speaking about the serial killer, Dean Corll. And we were delivered a comprehensive research document by Bhumika Sharma, so big thanks to Bhumika. There's a lot to this story, to Dean Corll's story. He's got a lot of victims, but we've got Shiloh and Scott to help us work through some of the psychological issues involved in Corll's killings.
And who better to help us out? Who better to help us navigate this particular individual than Dr. Shiloh and Dr. Scott? I mean, this serial killer checks all of the boxes that you would want checked if you're doing like a very complete psychological breakdown of somebody like this. I mean, the accomplices, the sadism, it goes on and on. He's got one part of every single serial killer trope that we typically hear of.
Yeah, good points. It is really, it's a really wild story, and we're going to go through that in just a few minutes. But first, we wanted to let you know a little bit more about LA Not So Confidential. They do have a weekly show now, so you can check out everything that they're up to at their website at la-not-so-confidential.com, and there's a link in the show notes. And Lance, they're fresh off their trip from the UK where they went to CrimeCon UK. They're not attending CrimeCon 2023 in Orlando, but we are, and that's coming up this week.
And we would have been there anyway, even if we weren't nominated for Outstanding Podcast Episodic Series at the Clue Awards. But as it turns out, Tim, we are nominated for the Outstanding Episodic Podcast Series category.
I know. It really is shocking, and I can't wait for this awards ceremony. I don't feel like we're going to win, but it's definitely, apparently, a possibility. So we got to keep that in the back of our minds, at least.
I know. So to ensure that we're going to win, neither one of us will be writing a speech so that when we do win, we're like, oh, we should have wrote a speech.
Right. That's a very cliche thing to say. I'm sure we'll throw that out there.
Definitely.
And something else I want to throw out there is follow us on social media at Crawlspace Podcast or Crawlspace Pod. And we also have Crawlspace Premium that is now available on Apple Podcasts. It's $4.99 a month. You get ad-free episodes, early releases, and our weekly bonus show. And don't worry, if you're not an Apple user, you can go to crawlspace.supportingcast.fm and get the same product there. And that is bundled with one of our other podcasts, Missing, and our new podcast from Crawlspace Media called Dark Valley.
You get all of that in one subscription service. My goodness, no wonder everyone loves it.
It's a lot of bang for your buck, especially if you're into serial killers, because Dark Valley is all about the unknown Connecticut River Valley killer. So make sure to check that out.
And before we get to this episode, just want to remind our listeners that the nonprofit that Tim and I are on the board of, Private Investigations for the Missing, founded by Bruce Maitland, Breonna Maitland's father, is hosting the first, hopefully annual, 5K run/walk for the missing. If you know anyone who likes to do these things, if you yourself like to do these things, 5Ks, if you like to raise money for a good charitable organization, you can go to piftm.org/run and you can register to run there. There's also a virtual element, but if you want to run in person, it'll be taking place in a town called Reading, Massachusetts on Sunday, October 8th, 11 a.m. And that just so happens to coincide with Breonna Maitland's birthday. So you'll be running for a good cause, for a good nonprofit, and we hope to see you there.
And what happens when I win this 5K, Lance? What do I get?
Tim, big prize for you if you end up beating myself, Julie Murray, and John Lordan's times. You get a lifetime of free listening to Crawlspace, the podcast.
Wow, that is certainly a prize, so cannot wait. All right, everyone, we're going to break quick for commercial here, and we'll be right back to talk about serial killer Dean Corll. Dean Corll was born on December 24th, 1939 in the area of Houston, Texas, and he is known as the Candyman, Lance, for reasons that we will get into. He's got at least 27 victims, and he killed between 1970 and 1973.
We just wanted to go through some of the names here of his victims. We have Jeffrey Conan, 18 years old, Danny Yates, who's 14 years old, James Glass was 14, Jerry Waldrop was 13 years old, Donald Waldrop was 15 years old, Randall Harvey was 15, David Hilligeist was 13, Gregory Mallory Winkle was 16, Reuben Watson was 17, Willard Rusty Branch Jr., 17.
And it goes on. Frank Aguirre was 18, Mark Scott, 17, Johnny DeLone was 16, Billy Balsh was 17, Stephen Sickman was 17, Wally J. Simino was 14, Richard Hembry was 13, Richard Kepner, 19, Joseph Lyles, 17, Billy Ray Lawrence, 15, Ray Blackburn, 20.
And it goes on. Homer Garcia was 15. John Sellers was 17. Tony Balsh was 15. Marty Jones was 18. Charles Carey Cobble was 17. And James Dremala was 13. Tim, those names just took us several minutes to read off.
I know. And it's especially tragic because I'm sure our listeners noticed how young these boys are. They're all boys. They're all in their teens. So it's pretty clear that Corll had a pattern of victims that he liked to murder. There really isn't a lot known about them because of their age and probably because of the time of their murder as well, being about 50 years ago now. You know, the internet wasn't invented back then, so there's just not a lot of photographs or just much about their personalities or murders specifically. But instead, you get more on this monster, Dean Corll.
And when you see the list of victims and the span of these crimes, you'd think that his name would be just among the top of your mind when you think of prolific serial killers or the most impactful serial killers, but he's not that well known. How is that even possible?
Yeah, it's a great point. And we ask the doctors that question.
I mean, the name never rings a bell with me. When I start to hear little pieces of the story, like his victims, co-conspirators killing him, I'm go, oh, okay, yeah, that's that guy. But yeah, I mean, he was essentially so close in the way that he offended and the way and the types of victims that he had to John Wayne Gacy. I mean, and before John Wayne Gacy, he really is that version of the South. So yeah, I don't know why that is. I mean, there's a lot of exploration in some really good platforms out there as to what was going on in the country at the time. And, you know, maybe it just wasn't ready to be put out into the media like it was when, you know, John Wayne Gacy's crimes were discovered. But yeah, I mean, certainly a dark case. And hopefully Dr. Scott and I can talk about some points in here that help bring some understanding, not that it's something that's easy to wrap your head around, but some of the questions that linger from cases like this.
Yeah, it's a great point. He's obviously a disturbing person. I don't know. Is it more disturbing than like John Wayne Gacy or something like that? I guess probably not, right?
I think it's really tough to try to distinguish the levels of disturbance between serial killers, right? But what Dean Corll did to these boys, these young men, in this really sadistic manner, this like body harm, this like body mutilation is like something that is out of a horror movie. Not saying what John Wayne Gacy did to his victims is any less damaging or less violent or less impactful, but the torture aspect of Corll is kind of nauseating, is very nauseating.
Yeah, it really is. Definitely part of why this story is so tough to consume, I think. And maybe why he's not sort of a household name serial killer.
But the Candyman.
Even with that, the clown is such a hook with John Wayne Gacy. But the candy really isn't like this huge hook that you would think, I feel like.
But you think it would be, though, right? I mean, that's the thing.
I would think so.
Don't take candy from a stranger. Like, that's the adage.
Yeah.
I think you're right, though. I think it does have something to do with how people consume this content. It's just uncomfortable to hear what he does to these young men.
Yeah, and I think part of the truth is potentially lost forever or kind of wrapped up in the firsthand accounts of his accomplices, which I think can be problematic. And doctors Shiloh and Scott take us through some of the reasons why.
I think it's interesting because all of the information that we have on Corll is either from his mom, who I'm not going to go so far as to call her an enabler by any means of, his crimes, but she certainly could not really come to terms with the fact of all the bad, horrible things that her son did. So we have information from her, and we have information from the co-conspirator that killed him. There were actually 3 young people there when he was murdered, the 2 boys that were his co-conspirators and 1 girl. But really the one, Henley, is the only one that really ever spoke. And he spoke a lot to media and to police. But, I think we have to take that with a grain of salt, because how much is he spinning this story to save his own hide in all of this?
Yeah, I would also offer a framework that I think is really important throughout this story. We were talking earlier about how wonderful this document is that's so thoroughly researched that we're pulling a lot of information from. But one of the things that, is not really being emphasized is the amount of substances that were being used by everyone. We don't really know about Corll himself, but he was using and grooming and attracting his potential victims and his co-conspirators with the use of drugs. And that's one level of it. But there's another level that I don't see talked about enough. And it has to do with the type of drugs that were being used. They were using inhalants. Which are incredibly, incredibly toxic on a neurological level. So it just, to me, it puts this whole framework on this whole case that we've got self-report with a lot of contradictory information coming from people who were really impaired at the time. So to me, it's like as much information as we have, I keep looking at it and going, is that a report from the time it happened, or is this a memory of someone who was a long-term huffer? They were inhaling a lot. There's a story about them trying to get themselves kind of worked up to go do something, and they stopped to huff, which is not really, that's not really a substance that's used to motivate you. It kind of knocks you out and really impairs your cognitive functioning. So that to me is just sort of this framework that I'm trying to wrap my head around as well.
Well, I think that's a great point, taking this information about some of these specifics with a grain of salt.
I think what we sometimes don't take into account when we're getting this information is that this probably did, or these types of incidents, these types of truly violent and disturbing moments impact people, right? Like, yeah, we're taking this information with a grain of salt, but we also have to take into account these people are probably very emotionally damaged because of this.
Richard Nixon was president of the United States back during this time period, Lance, and you might have been listening to the Carpenters or Tom Jones on the radio during this time, just to set up some background on the early 1970s.
And some popular movies of the time. I don't know if you remember the movie The Godfather, Tim.
Never heard of it.
This was a long time ago. The Godfather was made in 1972, so that's 51 years ago.
And we talked to Shiloh and Scott about the time period of these murders.
Kind of the old tagline, they say it was a different time, right? So you have things going on in the country, especially with young kids, where, there is a lot more freedom. There's hitchhiking. There is not the helicopter parenting that we see nowadays. There's just a lot more freedoms with kids and young kids. And from what I understand about the area in Texas where this took place. And he moved around a lot. Like that was his strategy to keep from being discovered. But kind of in the same two bigger subsections of like Houston, I believe, and Pasadena, Texas, was this area called the Heights that was really just kind of a lot of kids with went unsupervised. The cities were big enough to where lots of boys, I don't want to say dozens necessarily all at one time, but lots of boys would come up missing or run away. And seemed like this was an area of town that people did run away from. You know, they did not want to be trapped there. There's always this conversation around police not taking missing persons investigations seriously, especially with teens, because of the high rate of runaways. But I think this was truly a time in U.S. history where that wasn't that unusual. And maybe with a population that big, it wasn't as glaring to kind of look at those numbers spread out, you know, among weeks and months.
And here we go through some of Dean's upbringing, including his military background, really how young he was when this entire story unfolded. And he was also very premeditated in a lot of these acts, which I found particularly shocking. And really that continues to be shocking to me.
Yeah, I mean, he kind of had the perfect in even before he had accomplices because his mother owned a candy making company, right? So as stereotypical or like as much lore as you can have around kidnapping children, I mean, he was really doing those things. So much so where I think his mom's home or the factory, she was cooking out of her home for a long time. So I don't quite recall, but it was across the street from an elementary school. So he would just literally lure children with the promise of free candy. And that's how it started. So, you know, you have with the younger kids, the promises of candy and soda and things like that. And then when it got to more of the preteen adolescent kids, that's when, you know, some of this illicit substance use is happening that Dr. Scott was talking about, as well as other kind of, you know, partying factors like pool tables and just a place to sort of hang out. But yeah, I mean, he certainly was an expert, as many individuals with pedophilic disorder are, at grooming the victims. But also we can't forget that he groomed his accomplices as well. I mean, you have to really be able to size up and pick the perfect accomplice to be involved in something like that with you.
In looking at the time frame, so like you were saying about Dean's age, so he was born, I think, in 1939. So putting it again in another framework about sort of our confirmed kill range of his is 70 to 73, which is directly on the heels of what the U.S. was considered to be the sexual revolution. And so there was really a lot of controversy and discussion in the community, in the media at that time. It was the beginning of the exposure of, or the dealing with abuse in the Catholic Church. And child abuse was really, for the first time, starting to be talked about. What a lot of the pundits did, where they were jumping on, well, this is the result of the sexual freedom of the 60s, which there is no correlation. There's actually been studies done to that extent to show that, like, people coming into terms, you know, moving away from puritanical U.S. into more sexual liberation and understanding did not increase substantially the amount of sexual crimes. So there was a connection that was trying to be made, but that was not found. Another big factor at this time, this added level of secrecy, is because the majority of these crimes were male perpetrated on male. Even when it comes up from the younger victims into the teen victims, you look at all these other factors. These were young men that were probably chosen and targeted because of their income status or their social status. They made perfect victims because Dean had access to money and, like you said, these hidey holes, or, like, you know, different locations where he would set up. But he was using the enticement to these kids with maybe not a lot of prospects at the time, like, come work for me, you know, you'll make some money, and then continuing to ply them with substances. You know, there is a big leap, though, that's really interesting, is how do you go from having the young person that you have groomed to then groom and allocate other victims for you for the use of sexual pleasure, how do you make the leap from that into torture and killing? That's an interesting piece right there of how that transition was made. I don't know how we'll ever really know, because that's taking a lot of assumptions that your victim is going to go along with the next level of sexual deviance, sexual assault, rape, torture, those things. Also, again, as in with the case with Gacy at the time, or that parallel time, is that male on male sexual perpetration of violence was not really looked at by the police. It wasn't even kind of really conceptualized very much. It's like, men don't do that to each other, or if they do, then they're perverts. So let's just lump them in with all the other creepy perverts and not really pay much attention, because it was really along the same lines of, well, those people must have put themselves in that position. I mean, that we forget now in today's discussion about relationships and sexuality that just 50, 60 years ago, the world looked at these things very, very different. Thankfully, that has really, really changed a lot. So I just think it's fascinating, and I'm really interested in how he was able to entice his compatriots in these crimes from making the leap from sexual assault, which is bad enough, into torture and into murder.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
And we did mention just how many boxes Corll checks off when it comes to serial killer qualities. And the most disturbing one to me is this level of sexual sadism that he perpetrates on his victims with the mutilation, and it's very reminiscent to Albert Fish in that way. And not only is that one of those check boxes that he ticks off, but the rarity is explained to us by Dr. Shiloh and Dr. Scott. And also an interesting element to this that I really wasn't even thinking about is the difference between BDSM for sexual gratification and the line that is crossed here.
Well, it's confounding, and Dr. Shiloh can probably I'm sure she can offer some perspective on this as well. But at that point, it is about gratification, but it's not about sex. It's about power, dominance, control, and then also veering into this place, because you used Fish as an example of a really dark curiosity with bodily functions, right? So yes, there are some BDSM practices that include two consenting adults using what we call toys, some things that people would go, oh, wow, I don't want to really have anything to do with that, but they're accepted in these sexual practices. But here, this was used as almost like there's an experimental quality, I think, in his earlier crimes that we're aware of. One of the many things that confounds me in this particular story is that the reports, and like Dr. Shiloh pointed out from his mother, is how kind he was to animals, because we would have expected sort of, when you look at the equation for someone who ends up doing these kind of acts, you would think, well, there's got to be a history of torturing and killing animals, of oppositional or defiant behaviors as a child, or conduct disorder. And by all accounts of what we're looking at, he was, if not an excellent student, he was an accomplished student. He was took place as a musician. He was very responsible from the way he's presented. So this guy was hiding a lot. He was hiding a lot of psychopathic tendencies, I would say. Dr. Shiloh, what's your perspective on that?
I think that definitely has to be in place, because we're talking about an intersection where two things are happening here: sexual sadism coupled with psychopathy. So just for the audience, a little rundown: sexual sadism is a disorder, and it rises to the level of a clinical disorder when someone is taking sexual pleasure from things like humiliation, fear, anything else that's like mental harm to a person in those areas. And so acts of that nature can include restraint or imprisonment, biting, spanking, whipping, beating. And when someone is repeatedly practicing those things, either to someone who is not giving consent, a partner that is not giving consent, or when those behaviors or those fantasies about those types of behaviors cause the individual some really significant distress, or they become dysfunctional in their life because of it, that's when we say that it's a sexual sadism disorder. So that falls under the big umbrella of paraphilias or paraphilic disorders, where are these like atypical sexual interests. Only 2 to 5% of sexual offenders are sexual sadists. So if we're looking at sex offenders in total, we're talking about a very small percentage that are disordered in this way. And the majority of sexual sadists who are offenders, like 87%, offend against adults. They're not even offending against children. So we're talking about a very, very rare individual just by breaking down numbers of the disorder here. So when we combine that with traits of antisocial personality disorder or full-on psychopathy, that's when sexual sadism becomes especially dangerous in this way, because we're talking about combining it with traits of poor impulse control, dishonesty. I mean, that sounds so like such a light way to put it, but will lie about the behaviors, will cover up their behaviors, complete lack of empathy and remorse for their victims. So obviously you can see that's like the perfect cocktail leading up to what his behavior was and why he was able to present so well, like so many of these offenders that we talk about. That's the psychopathy coming into place, and that's what they're showing the rest of the world.
Dr. Shiloh said only 2% of sexual offenders are sexual sadists. And you have to wonder about Corll's relationship with his mom. But in this next clip, we speak mostly about Corll and his girlfriend, Betty, during the time of these murders.
Yeah, I really wonder what was going on with Betty and what kind of, things Betty was dealing with or choosing to ignore. And I don't mean like that she knew what was going on as far as his other sexual activity or certainly the murders he was involved with. But, they had a very strange relationship as far as not living together. They, I think, attempted to have sexual intercourse once, and that didn't pan out. And I think they were together 5 years, I want to say, if I remember right. That relationship didn't sound like it was moving along in the way in which we would have expected kind of a heterosexual normal couple to in the 70s. So yeah, there's just a lot of questions there.
If he's committing these acts, because you're saying you don't know if Betty, how much she knew, she claimed to not know anything about this, but I mean, on average, that's like a victim every 6 weeks or so.
Sure, but if they're not living together, I think there's a lot you can hide.
One of the things that I think is particular related to what Dr. Shiloh was saying as far as his schedule is that this recurring theme throughout the descriptions of him is how much he had going on. Like he was supporting his mom's business, he was running another business, and he has all these different properties. So this is a guy with it's a strange way to say it. He had a lot of energy. So that might have been something that was an excuse factor with Betty, is that maybe she had felt like she had to accept these eccentricities in their relationship because he was so busy. Unfortunately, she didn't know all the other things that were going on with his grooming of co-conspirators and driving these assaults. But he was a busy guy, so I'm sure that was an excuse to some extent.
It's hard to get into the head of someone like Betty when you're speculating whether or not she knew on some level what was going on. But I can't imagine the intimacy that the two of them had I can't imagine that it was like anything close to normal. Or maybe they didn't actually have very intimate moments. Maybe that was something that he wasn't capable of doing with someone who he was consistently close with. Like the only way he could express himself in a sexual manner was in this violent, sadistic way.
Right. And I wonder if it was all a guise for him, because, I mean, how much of his life that he set up was a guise? Again, the level of premeditation here in these murders is absolutely shocking. He, set up different addresses and got accomplices to help him. I just feel like his whole life was phony.
Well, that's interesting. You said his whole life was phony. I'm sure in his head, this was the reality. Like the true reality was this behavior and this compulsion, and everything else that wasn't this must have been the phony part for him, right?
I think so. Yeah, exactly. I think the dark and evil parts were the real him. Yeah. But I just don't understand how there weren't reports of screaming. I mean, he apparently tortured these kids. Also, I know this is a complicated answer and we get into it in a little bit, but how none of these accomplices went to the police. And then what about all the kids going missing in that area during that time?
It goes back to, there seems to be a lot of planning that went into this. He's very organized and linear in his plans. For as psychopathic as his actions are, that denotes a lot of planning. And that is also related to, I guess, how he was able to keep all these plates spinning in the air with the relationship, the businesses, the multiple properties.
Yeah, I think that's something I always wonder about when she said plate spinning in the air is, and I don't know any research that's been done about this, is just kind of how do they think this is going to end, right? Because we're talking about people that do have a good deal of planning. And at what point does the planning sort of peak, I guess? And then, we hear about them becoming disorganized, right? Like super frenzied. And then that's when they get sloppy. But I even wonder before that, what the aforethought is, because I highly doubt it's just like the next conquest, the next victim. With such high planners and people that have been highly intelligent, you would think that there is some future orientation as to like, how long can I keep this up? And just kind of thinking out loud here. There is one thing I wanted to talk about as far as the torture aspect. There are very clear-cut cognitive distortions that we see with sexual offenders. And these are thinking patterns that they start creating for themselves that allow them to essentially be okay with what they're doing. If you are as high as you can be as a psychopath, you probably wouldn't need a cognitive distortion necessarily, but most people are not at that high level. The most psychopathic person I ever worked with just barely hit like high on the psycho, or hit the threshold, if you will, for psychopathy. And he was terrifying. So, think people really high up there might not have to do this, but at some point they're going to feel a little squeegee or a little nervous or a little anxious about this. And how do they sort of rectify that in their mind, right? So they have to create these thinking patterns that then justify what they're doing. And with sexual sadists, what they end up doing is convincing themselves that the child is bad, the child is evil, or is even like sick and perverted, and that they deserve this. So they're sort of doling out the punishment on this child because, of whatever they've made up in their head about how bad this really innocent, as we know it, innocent victim is.
Yeah, again, I think like in my head, it's hard to get into the head of someone like his girlfriend Betty, and in addition, the accomplices, because at some level they did something wrong too, and it just keeps piling on. And the more you delay reaching out to the authorities or reaching out to somebody who can stop it, you're definitely too far in. It's got to be super confusing. And I mean, confusing is just like not the most effective word to use, but it has to really F with your head to the point where you're just frozen and you don't know what to do. And you only do what you're being told. I guess that's the point of the brainwashing part of it.
And here we talk a little bit about Corll's upbringing and question whether or not abuse was in his household when he was growing up. And I believe there are no reports of that, but I think it's fair for Dr. Shiloh to be a little bit skeptical about it.
And that's another confounding factor because of the research that we look at. The most tragic thing that seems to have happened was his parents' divorce. I would be even interested in, like, is there any report of what he was like as a toddler, right? Was there any evidence of like reactive attachment disorder? Was there any kind of evidence that laid the groundwork for who he was before he became this. And I feel like Dr. Shiloh was sort of implying earlier that a lot of this is self-report or parental, collateral report, and collateral report has a bias. And also there wasn't a great deal of research that went into talking to everybody on every level immediately after this was over because of the enormity of the crimes. There was a lot to be investigated about the victims, not so much the perpetrator, from my perspective.
Yeah. So a couple things I want to hit on with that question, Lance, because I think it's a good one. And I think it's one that people automatically think, like, how does this link back to his childhood, right? There must be an explanation there. And first, I want to make a statement that we know now from the research that children who are sexually abused do not necessarily go on to become offenders themselves. If we look at sexual offenders, only about a third of them have any history of sexual abuse in their past. And if you think of 1 out of 4 women and 1 out of 5 men have sexual abuse history, that's not, too far off than the general population. Second thing I want to say about that is there's this notion, and we don't know, but the mom says that his father was not abusive. I'm highly suspect of that. She divorced and remarried him again. And sometimes remarrying the same person can be indicative of that domestic abuse cycle. So I'm just going to say I'm highly suspect of that whole situation. Doesn't mean he was abusive towards the child. Certainly doesn't mean he was sexually abusive. It could have just been physical abuse going on in the home, or maybe Dean witnessed intimate partner violence between his parents. But when it comes to psychopathy, that is really a combination of biological based issues as well as severe childhood abuse. So the way that I usually explain it is it is made up of this 3-legged stool. One of the components is genetic, and this is the best research that we have at this point. It's genetic. There's a gene, the MAOA gene. It's known as the warrior gene. And there's a subsection of that, the MAOA-L gene, that has been linked to aggression, antisocial behavior that we see as a marker in people who meet that threshold for psychopathy. And then there is significant brain functioning that is different for those individuals as well, that we can see in brain mapping. And then the third leg of that stool is generally severe childhood trauma. So if that was happening in the home, that would make absolute sense to me how he ends up with the psychopathic part. It doesn't mean he had to be sexually abused. It just means his psychopathy is coming out in that way because he is also a sexual sadist.
The only thing that I would want to add to that from my experience in working in corrections and the training that I got working in the state prison and corrections, prison versus jail, is that a lot of research has come out about the number of men who perpetrate serious levels of IPV generally have a history of head trauma. So this is not so much part of that 3-legged stool that Shiloh was talking about, but if we're to surmise that maybe he witnessed intimate partner violence between mom and dad, and maybe it was chronic and severe, and then he had this genetic foundation, and then if there was ever a head injury from playing sports or from even just playing around as a kid, there's just a lot of factors that can create something like this. And I still keep my original perspective that I started with, that it seems like a big leap. Like, what information do we not have to get us from there to there?
Yeah, no, it is a big leap. That was my first thing, just reading through the information on him. I was like, what's going on? Like, this guy has such an unremarkable first part of his life. But once I realized, like, okay, where are we getting this information from? Again, I think we don't have the whole story.
And one thing that we didn't even consider, Scott mentions in this as well, which is the possibility that head trauma might have occurred.
Yeah, it's hard to measure what damage can be caused in a person by head trauma, but we do hear that a lot of serial killers had head trauma at an early age. And it seems like the combination of trauma or mental illness in Dean Corll was very rare, but just how common is psychopathy in the general population? We asked the doctors.
I just want to throw out some percentages of psychopathy in different populations. So with the general population, we're looking at just 1% of the population, right? So very, very small. If we look at men who have been convicted of crimes like the prison population, 20% of them can be diagnosed with psychopathy. If we look at women who have been convicted of crimes, it's half that, it's 10%. Child molesters, 10%. Rapists, it jumps up to 35%. So again, we're seeing that involves personally, and I think in a lot of ways in the forensic psychology world and the sex offender treatment that I did, we consider any sexual acts against a child violent, but violence in the term of forcing sex upon an adult, if that makes sense that the numbers would jump up because it's more, it involves force. It's not necessarily just grooming and talking a child into something that doesn't necessarily have to be physically violent, although it's non-consensual, of course. But when we get to serial killers, 90% of them would hit that marker for psychopathy.
And on the same sort of grounds as brainwashing, I guess grooming is in there too. So we get into the psychology of grooming and being groomed in a bit more detail.
When you the process of grooming changes the cognitive perspective and perception of the individual who's being groomed. You become so enmeshed with that dominant personality that you don't feel like you can, you don't and there may have been threats that he made. He may have had some way that he held power over them or coercion. But, you read interviews with many victims of long-term kidnapping. And I don't want to necessarily say Stockholm, but there is this thing that happens where you become so identified with your captor and their practices that you lose a piece of your identity into their identity.
Yeah. So interestingly, there was some research done way back in 1993 with some of the folks from the Behavioral Analysis Unit, Roy Hazelwood, Park Dietz, who's a forensic psychologist, and they looked specifically at this phenomenon of partner indoctrination for sexual sadism specifically. And probably it was majority of male, female offending partners. We've heard of, speaking back to Stockholm Syndrome, which Scott and I have a full episode on why that's not actually what we think it is, but a kind of a famous case of the girl in the box. So a girl that was kidnapped and held by her kidnappers who were sexual sadists, and it was a man and a woman team. This research has shown that there's really kind of 5 steps to this indoctrination for getting a participant into sexual sadism, because I already said that sexual sadism, it's this disorder that is really ingrained in people kind of innately. So how do you then turn someone else into a sexual sadist, right? And the first step is kind of the first step we see in a lot of cults and types of brainwashing. It's that love bombing. It's showering them with affection and attention. So that might just have been to kind of get them roped in. And in Dean's case, giving these teens with nothing else to do, maybe a job, a little bit of money in their pocket, but then also providing all of the alcohol and a space for them to just hang out with each other and not have to be around their parents. They're not getting that anywhere else, right? And that's what these offenders are really good at, is sitting back and observing and sizing up vulnerable victims that they can then tailor some of this affection and attention to. And then the second step is starting to engage in sexual activities with these individuals that are incrementally beyond whatever their comfort zone is. So it could be even with these boys that might not have felt that they were attracted to men or other boys as well. So that might be just engaging in any sort of sexual activity or having them engage in any sort of sexual activity with him, meaning Dean. And we don't know really how they identified as far as their sexual orientation, but they were certainly participating in these activities. And then when you have them doing that, engaging in that sexual activity beyond their comfort zone, then the percentage of unwanted sexual activities starts to dominate over maybe some of the lighter stuff or the stuff that they're willing to engage in. And so you're just sort of turning up the dial to the activities that maybe Dean was interested in with sort of this experimentation and this torture, and also having them participate, right? So this could parallel be something they're engaging in with him, but also now that they're being asked to either witness or hold down someone, or in this case, lure these victims in. I doubt that was top on their list of what they wanted to do, but now they are partnered with him. And then social isolation is a big part of the control factor here. So now that they are essentially tied up in this with him, it's going to breed this loyalty that they have to have. They're in too deep at this point. And that's when the torture can either begin on them as victims, or they start participating in what ultimately led to be murders.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program. And then in this next clip, we talk a bit more about Elmer Wayne Henley. Henley is actually the person who killed Corll. Corll was never arrested. He was killed by Henley during a very violent and shocking scene, part of a day that we go over in this next clip. But one of the reasons Henley gave for participating in Corll's schemes was that he feared his younger brother was going to be targeted by Corll.
Yeah, maybe that was a part of it. But, the night that this all unfolded, so Dean had the three teens basically huffing, engaging in some of the huffing substance abuse until they passed out, tied them all up. But at some point, Henley either comes to or doesn't pass out all the way. And he is tied up to this torture board that essentially had just 4 holes drilled in the corners where he could tie them up by their wrists and their ankles. And he talked Dean out of murdering him essentially that night, because by this point, Dean was about to flee. He was going to move back out of state with his mom. He felt like something was up, whether he thought Henley and Brooks were going to kill him or that he was about to get caught. He was really unraveling at this point. And so Henley ended up talking him out of handcuffs or being tied up. And that's when he got the gun and shot him. The fear of him offending against his little brother may have been sort of a long-term fear of this could happen down the road if he continues. But in that moment and the way Henley tells it, it certainly was an issue of self-defense.
And a little bit on the side here related to Henley is he is still currently serving 6 life sentences for participating in the murders, the rapes, the tortures. So he is still in prison right now, but he is making pleas for a compassionate release. He's been denied parole in the past, and I believe he's coming up again on a parole hearing, and he's been pretty vocal about requesting some compassion.
Yeah, it is pretty shocking to hear that he not only has spent, decades in prison, but he's still in prison at the time of this recording and is not guaranteed to ever get out. You can't help wonder what his defense was, and if it wasn't self-defense, why wasn't it? I don't know. I feel like the legal system today evolves, and I just feel like he would not still be in prison if this happened today.
It was murder. It's interesting because we just did, Dr. Shiloh and I, at least one episode a month is a review of documentaries. And we just did the Menendez plus Menudo documentary. And we had a great time exploring how the discussion around abuse has changed. And if their case was tried today, it would likely be looked at in a very different way, because there's a lot of evidence that really does corroborate that both of them were pretty much sexually brutalized, as well as emotional and physical abuse. And it would be interesting to see if anybody would ever be interested in reviewing his case to see, like, if we look through it through modern eyes, it's no more surprising than several other more recent cases where victims of long-term abuse have turned around and killed their perpetrators.
And I don't even know for sure what was he actually convicted on? Was it just the murder of Dean, or was it also participating in the murders of the boys? Because that would keep him in forever.
Yeah. Here it's calling him a serial killer and saying that he's got 7 victims, but it was all in that time period. He was apprehended on the day that Corll was shot dead. So.
Right. And Brooks went to prison as well. I believe he died of COVID in prison.
Henley is serving 6 consecutive terms of 99 years for his involvement in what it calls the Houston mass murders.
Yeah, and he was the talker. He would certainly talk about it. Brooks never said a peep beyond, just what he had to say in court, according to his attorneys.
It's an interesting dynamic. I mean, clearly he participated in that. And I'm not advocating for anyone to, I'm not advocating for the doors to be open for him. But it is interesting just to look at how our view of these types of things has changed in the past 4 or 5 decades, where we're willing to look at, well, what is the level of responsibility? At what point do we move over into, well, no, you're fully personally responsible for these things you took part in. But if they were a different age, would we have looked at it? Like if they were just 6 years younger and maybe they were minors, would we look at it in that same way? So yeah, this is a fascinating and complex and quite contradictory case in many ways for me.
Hopefully this was somewhat educational, sort of going through his psychology a bit with Doctors Shiloh and Scott.
And just to reiterate, the importance of talking about a serial killer like Dean Corll is that, again, he fits pretty much every single category when you're trying to educate yourself on these violent individuals, these extremely violent individuals. So if you want to know about the psychology of someone who practices severe, extreme sexual sadism, you can read into Corll. You can look into Corll. If you want to figure out how somebody manages to manipulate others into being accomplices in these extreme violent situations, you can look up Dean Corll. I think this is a psychological buffet that you want to be a part of if this is in your interest wheelhouse.
I mean, with just some of the percentages I gave you, I mean, this is like the rarest of the rare types of, 1, mental health disorders, 2, paraphilic disorders, and then looking at tying in the criminality to it. This is pretty darn rare. So 1, it's very easy to study in a sense of like, we have this one guy, we can kind of pick it apart as a case study for as much information as we have. And we can kind of compare and contrast, right? Like we started off talking today about how this compares with John Wayne Gacy. So many similarities. I mean, scarily so, right? I mean, down to sort of the handcuff tricks that they would use and the torture boards that they had. But I think the question is then, like, how useful is that? Like, how do we extrapolate that to other offenders? And statistically speaking, you just really can't. I mean, it would be irresponsible to take something so rare and then make overgeneralizations to a bigger population. Interesting? Well, shit, yes, of course it is. That's why we picked these jobs that we picked. But as far as, I think we always want to look towards how is this better for society, and that would speak to prevention. Right. So, not just the fascination of what they've done and what we can learn from that to make us feel more important, but it's about what do we take, what we've learned from it in a prevention manner, whether it's looking at severe childhood abuse in homes or child mental health, or identifying when someone needs intervention somewhere along the way. I mean, those are the key pieces that maybe we can pluck out if we see enough similarities, and then design some intervention and treatment for folks.
And then piggybacking on that, continuing to improve police work and educate police forces in whatever capacity they exist across the country in understanding, you have to look, you can't make assumptions about your victim profile. Like, don't, just because especially at this time, these people, whether these young men were gay or not, they were certainly, if they were, they're part of a marginalized community, right? So same thing happened with Dahmer, is that it was all kind of poo-pooed because nobody was really looking at the number of young men of color who were disappearing.
You mentioned like law enforcement investigation wise, but also just the laws keeping up with some of this stuff, because after this case, and still in the 70s, there was another big like Boy Scout pedophile ring that was discovered. And as a result of really good investigative work done, and I think it was out of New Orleans, the laws ended up changing because they were kind of looking at it in terms of like federal sex trafficking, but federal sex trafficking at the time only pertained to female victims, which is so wild. Like, they just basically didn't consider that boys would be products and sold in that way. So the federal laws ended up changing. But, Scott and I, from the work we did with sex offenders, we knew how backward some of those laws were, and they just hadn't caught up even to the technology of how sexual offending happens. And there's some really old laws on the books.
There's another part about the perpetrators that are still alive and are imprisoned and that we pull information from provide this enormous resource for research and observation. But we also have to remember, as with what I was talking about earlier, that sort of collaborative information that comes from family members and community members, that the perpetrators themselves are not always the best self-report objects, because there's an innate self-centeredness that expresses, they may be psychopaths, or they may have, a full-on diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder. But there's also like this level of narcissism, so that they're bending facts. And one of the most important examples of that is Henry Lee Lucas, coming forward now with all of this new information about the over confession to things, because he was getting this validation. I mean, there certainly is, like, if we go total Freudian here in the forensic world, there is a need, there is an emptiness, there is a desire for validation that is sought by all of these perpetrators. So we can conjecture a lot about this dead perpetrator now, but we've got limited information from his one surviving co-conspirator, right? And then we have other people that just sort of, in order to stay relevant, like Dennis Rader, just keeps talking like, oh, I want to be able to comment. My opinion on this fellow killer of mine is valuable. And so my point really that I want to come away from this with, or to leave with your listeners, is that to be very careful about when we ask, what can we learn from these people? And because not all of it that is offered is of value, and in some instances can lead law enforcement and researchers in very non-fruitful directions.
And finally, the doctors recommended a couple of documentaries that they watched during their schooling. One of them is Dr. Anna Salter's documentary called Sex, Lies, and Sex Offenders. And apparently that is with groomers who are discussing their grooming firsthand. And Scott recommended a documentary called Chicken Hawk, and I believe both of these are available on YouTube. Big thanks to the doctors for helping us work through this story, and thanks a lot for listening. We really appreciate it.